You're listening to the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
God's exaltation has always been demonstrated by his mighty acts, and we see that with the destruction of Pharaoh's chariots and the soldiers in the Red Sea. We see that here. It just shows up over and over and over again in the Old Testament. So because of the victory that he has brought about, the future victory of the Assyrian over the Assyrian, when God destroys him, the Antichrist, he will fill Zion, that's Jerusalem, okay, with justice and righteousness.
The Lord cannot exist with sin and injustice. This is mainly why heaven will be such a wonderful place. In today's teaching, Pastor Ken will show how even on earth, the Lord often deals with evil by establishing his mighty power. There's no side you want to be on other than God's. As the world continues to spiral downward and sin runs rampant, choose to link yourself to the one who will reign above all. Marvel yourself at the person and power of God all throughout Scripture. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Isaiah, chapter 32, as he continues his message, God's Plan for Israel's Enemies.
I mean, a person cannot claim to accept the gospel and the obligations that go with it, and at the same time live in obedience to the flesh. But we got a lot of people who are trying to do that right now. God will not be, and I love this, outwitted or evaded. Doesn't happen. And that's what's about to happen to the Assyrian army. In Genesis 12:3, God says this to Abraham, and it's a promise that still exists today. So that's why we're seeing what Isaiah is saying about all the enemies of Israel. He tells Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse. And in you all the tribes of the earth will be blessed. Now that's what Yahweh said to Abraham. It applies to him and his descendants. So here at Calvary, we want to be a blessing to Israel. But as we scan through history, we find out there's been a lot of folks who didn't care. And it's littered with nations who thought they could impose their will on his people. So let me give you a partial list. No matter how big and bad the enemy, they will fall. Daniel 2 shows that. So the partial list, you have Assyria. They're going down. Babylon will follow them. Then there'll be the Medes and the Persians. Then the Greeks, and that's the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. They'll be going back and forth. Then the Romans. Then the Ottoman Empire. And then I kind of left because the people leave. So now I'm talking about the Spanish Inquisition where they kicked all of the Jews out. Didn't end well for Spain. They lost their empire. The Soviet Union, remember them? Now most of them live in Israel. Most of the Jews do. How about Germany? You know, when the last Nazi died, the wall came down. But didn't go down until that last Nazi leader died in the prison. I find that intriguing. Oh, then of course we know the beast is going to be one coming up. And I look at that and I go, this is not a complete list. There's others on the list. But you look at that and you go, they took a hard line against Israel and this happened. They took a hard line against Israel and this happened. There's a couple of books out today that show that those nations that try to negotiate land away from Israel or try to negotiate positions from Israel that are not favorable to God and God's people, that they don't do too well. That hurricanes tend to hit the day after the decision is made. Or the storm of the century wipes out a certain president's home up in Maine after a decision is made. I mean, it just goes on. God means what he says. He has not changed his word. Remember, we have a 20% who believe there's moral absolutes. God's saying, oh, it should be 100%. Nothing changes. Verse 2. Now, there's a prayer. O Lord, be gracious to us. We've waited for you. Be their strength every morning, our salvation also in the time of distress. So we've got this warning against the enemies, and then now we have a prayer. Back in chapter 29 and 30, Yahweh asked for his people, trust me, okay? And he promised he'd take care of the enemy. But instead, they sent ambassadors to Egypt and try to cut a deal. He even went as far to expose all who would listen that there were top secret negotiations going on. And by the way, here's where they're happening. The people needed to trust Yahweh, but they insisted on doing life on their way and on their terms. So for most of Judah, it won't end well. But what the Lord is showing here prophetically in verse 2 is what the attitude of the people will be when Yahweh deals with the enemy and does so his way. So what we're seeing here is the day after the Assyrians are destroyed by God on the hills of Jerusalem, the people have a change of heart. And the change of heart is going to happen several times throughout history, ultimately at the Battle of Armageddon at the end. But unlike what we saw earlier, now there's a humble attitude being expressed by the remnant. The remnant of his people, under pressure, ask for the grace of God, knowing they deserve the judgment of God. They ask for his grace instead. There's a recognition of how gracious Yahweh has been in the past, and that those who have waited on him have not been disappointed. Those who remain have waited on the Lord. Then Isaiah himself jumps into the prayer, and he prays for the remnant who have waited. He asks the Lord to be their strength every day. And then he asks that they would let Yahweh be their salvation in times of distress. Now, Isaiah knows firsthand how stubborn Yahweh's chosen people are. He saw the northern kingdom go away into captivity, and they're in exile. He has also seen it in Judah and warned the current administration of King Hezekiah, and they listen a little and they don't listen a lot. He's asking the Lord that his people, God's people, would turn towards him in the future. And Isaiah is looking at events that go up to and including the Assyrian attack in the last days. The attack of Armageddon is what he's seeing. So he himself is praying, emulating what the real believer in the future is going to be praying. And he models for others a pattern. Prayer asks for God's support in staying power and pleads that he makes it effective daily. The need's constant. It's not just when there's something bad going on. Verse 3, at the sound of the tumult, peoples flee. At the lifting up of yourself, nations disperse. So as Isaiah prays, there's an expression of confidence that the whole world is helpless before God's power and is going to be utterly plundered. At the sound of tumult, the nations flee, peoples, nations. And at the lifting up of yourself, as God lifts up, the nations leave. They just head for the hills. That's going to be a reality, by the way, when the Assyrian army camps in the hills of Jerusalem. They are preparing to besiege the city, and then the destroyer goes out and does a number on 180,000 of them overnight. In Hebrew, though, the words translated as flee and disperse are a type, they're called perfects of certainty. So in other words, you can read it instead of flee and disperse, it means sure to or doomed to. It's going to happen. It's a done deal. All God has to do is stand up in the face of all the mass powers of the world, and it's over before it even starts. By the way, I've read the end of the book in Revelation, we win. And that's a reference back to Revelation 19. But the reality of what's been prophesied about the upcoming resolution of the Assyrian army problem is again being revealed, and so's the end of the age. So if you want to know what it's going to be like at the end of the age, is there going to be plunder? Oh, well, yeah. Ezekiel talks about it in chapter 39, in verse 3. God talking to Gog Magog, the army at the end of the age. I will knock your bow out of your left hand and make your arrows fall from your right hand. You will fall dead on the mountains of Israel, you and all your troops and the people who are with you. I give you as food to every kind of bird and every wild beast. You will fall dead in the open field, for I've spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. I will send fire on Magog and those who live securely in the coastlands, and they will know I am the Lord. I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. I will not let my holy name be profaned anymore. And the nations will know that I'm the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. Realize it's coming, and it will be done, declares the sovereign Lord. It is the day I have spoken about. Then those who live in the cities of Israel will go out and use the weapons for kindling, the shields, bows, arrows, war clubs, and spears. They'll burn them for 7 years. They won't need to take wood from the field or cut down trees from the forest, because they'll make fires with the weapons. They'll take the loot from those who looted them and seize the plunder of those who plundered them, declares the sovereign Lord. Yep, that's it, done. Imagine 186,000 Assyrians killed on the hills of Jerusalem, and the rest of the Assyrian army leaves in a big hurry. and they just leave everything out there. Same situation. So we get a picture of it in near term, and we get a picture of it in the future. Now, the event is still in the future. This is a prophecy. But the Lord is letting his people know that when he moves, the destroyer, the one who's been gathering all the plunder as they conquered the cities of Judah, will themselves be plundered. In a lively way, the prophet even goes on to describe the situation after the enemy has had to flee suddenly. People will pounce on the spoil like caterpillars or as locusts to devour the grain. And they'll collect the spoil after an enemy army has retreated in haste. And everybody's happy about that because they all get a share. So we see that in Ezekiel. Now, and you think about caterpillars. Anybody ever watch a caterpillar do its thing? I grow Mexican milkweed. It looks like a weed, but it's intentional because the caterpillar for the monarch butterfly eats that, and then they make their cocoon. And they're fun to watch because when a caterpillar hits a leaf, a branch that's got all these leaves on it, and if you come back and look at it in 30 minutes, the leaves are gone. And that's one big, fat, happy caterpillar. He's ready to become a cocoon now, and then he'll be a butterfly in a couple of days. But this is the kind of the picture that the folks in Judah would be familiar with, and this is what he's trying to communicate. He says, just like a caterpillar, when it does its thing, it strips the plant. When you go out and you find all these dead Assyrians, you're going to strip that camp clean. There won't be anything left, and you're going to do it just as fast. By the time we finish verse 4, the destroyer, the enemy, referred to in the first verse, they've been destroyed and plundered. They're done. The Lord sent a messenger, as it says in 2 Chronicles 32:21, and he wiped out all the soldiers, princes, and officers in the army of the king of Assyria. So Sennacherib returned home humiliated. And when he entered the temple of his God, some of his own sons struck him down with a sword. And that did happen. We know that. So in the future, well, Zechariah 14 tells us what the future is. Zechariah 14:12-14 says, and this will be the falling by which the Lord will slaughter all the people. As many as made war against Jerusalem, their flesh will melt while they've stood on their feet, and their eyes will run out of their sockets, and their tongues will melt in their mouth. And it will be in that day a great terror of the Lord will come upon them, and each one will seize the hand of his neighbor, and his hand will be joined to the hand of his neighbor. And Judah will set up an army in Jerusalem and will gather together the strength of all the people from all around. And here it is, gold, silver, and clothing for a great multitude. In other words, they're going to plunder them. That's the Septuagint version too, by the way. Talk about graphic. Soon the Assyrian army is going to be dealt with by the Lord. And the people of Judah will walk out from behind the walls and see all the dead bodies, which they got to take care of. And it's not going to be the first time they're going to have to do this. They're going to have to do that at the end of the age too. And they'll take spoil from what's left. And they're going to jump on it just as fast as a caterpillar or a swarm of locusts. If you've ever seen a swarm of locusts, they can strip a field in no time. This is going to be repeated at the end of the age when the army of the Assyrian, the Antichrist, is dealt with by the Lord. And once again, as we saw in Zechariah, there's going to be plunder taken by those who live in Jerusalem. And in both cases, we have a fatally confused enemy and an overjoyed and excited remnant. And then we see, because of this, Zion is at peace. The irony, though, is that what the Lord's saying here is that Assyria will be picked over even more thoroughly than were its victims. And they will be. Verse 5 and 6. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He's filled Zion with justice and righteousness, and he will be the stability of your times. A wealth of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is his treasure. So because of the victory, God is lifted up above all others. There is no one who is worshiped more than the Lord. He's exalted. This is the end of the age we're talking about here. He becomes king. Jesus is the one who comes, and it's the Messiah. It's a consistent story throughout the Old Testament. The actions of God on behalf of his people result in God's exaltation. And then the next generation shows up and they don't remember it. But when we get to that, we'll find that is the problem even in the future. But only after the enemy is dealt with can Zion be filled with justice and righteousness. So literally, God's exaltation has always been demonstrated by his mighty acts. And we see that with the destruction of Pharaoh's chariots and the soldiers in the Red Sea. We see that here. It just shows up over and over and over again in the Old Testament. So because of the victory that he has brought about, the future victory of the Assyrian over the Assyrian, when God destroys him, the Antichrist, he will fill Zion, that's Jerusalem, okay, with justice and righteousness. He can't do that until he's dealt with the problem posed by the big dog of the enemy at the gates. Because they've been brought low, they're not going to be in Zion. But God's remnant will be in Zion. Absolutely will be. This scenario also here that's presented is also presented kind of like a royal procession. Yahweh is moving through the land, and he arrives at the goal that is Zion. And if you study the scriptures, you see that when Jesus returns, he starts off in the south towards Basra, and he moves north, lands at the Mount of Olives, causing a massive earthquake, and the ground actually changes, everything changes. And then it's over with at that point. So it does make sense. Yahweh's new governance is established, in other words, the Messianic kingdom, and it's going to be marked by justice, righteousness, and stability, or order, safety, security, and reliability. It's the same root word, by the way, that's used in the Hebrew for faith. So when he comes, it'll be faith. It'll be reality. And the new kingdom is gone and taken over everything. In the old kingdom, which had destruction, debauchery, and everything else, it's finished. It's done. Or as it says in Zechariah 14, verses 6 to 9, on that day, there'll be no light, cold, or frost. It'll be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time, there'll be light. And on that day, living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half to the eastern sea and half to the western sea, and it shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. That's what Isaiah is talking about. He's talking about that moment when Jesus Christ takes over planet Earth. Verse 6 ends with what all the inhabitants of the Messianic kingdom will hold as valuable: the fear of the Lord. Now, that word is yirat in Hebrew. There's nothing else in the world that's more valuable than the fear of the Lord. It also means the salvation of the Lord, the profound respect of the Lord, his grace. It all ties into that one Hebrew word. The fear of the Lord is the key to all blessing. And we don't have it except as a gift. So salvation is grace, and it is in the Old Testament just as it is in the New. Verses 7 to 9. Now, this is what's going on as the enemy is coming up before God hits. And then when God hits, everything changes. Behold, their brave men cry in the streets. What he's talking about is what's going on in Jerusalem, okay? Envision the Assyrian army surrounding the city, and he's talking about what's happening to the members of the military. Their brave men cry in the streets. And the ambassadors of peace weep bitterly. The highways are desolate, the traveler has ceased. He's broken the covenant, he's despised the cities, he has no regard for man. The land mourns and pines away. Lebanon is shamed and withers. Sharon is like a desert plain, and Bashan and Carmel lose their foliage. Before we see verses 5 and 6 happen, the land will be reduced to what we see in verses 7 to 9. And as we look at the current situation in Judah for Isaiah's time, this is a prophetic picture of traumatic conditions yet to come. Now, stop and think about it. You've got an Assyrian army of a couple 100,000 men, armed to the teeth, and they show up in the hills. They establish their camp, and they've systematically worked their way through Judah and taken all the cities. And we've shown pictures of what's left of some of them. They're just hills with nothing there. You can still see the siege ramps. The remaining strength of the military of Judah knows they do not have the capability to defend the city. And because of that, they're reduced to tears, and they're walking through the street crying because they can't do anything to defend the people. The mighty men are distraught. The guys who were the biggest of the big, they can't do anything. The ambassadors, by the way, who went and cut the deal with Egypt, They now realize that everything they did and all they gave away didn't mean a thing. There's no more cover-up now. Everybody knows it didn't work. The treaty has been broken, and Egypt's not coming to save them. Not at all. They too are reduced to tears. We're seeing the mighty and the proud of Jerusalem being reduced and humbled. And I'm reminded of what it says in Proverbs 16, verses 17 and 18. The highway of the upright turns aside from evil. Whoever guards his way preserves his life. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Judah has learned a very hard lesson. This is still in the future for them. It's prophetic. It's not a one-time occurrence either. This is going to happen more than once to the city. In the future, the same realization will take place among the people as they stare down Babylon, as they stare down Rome, and Rome twice, once in 70 AD and again in 135 AD. And then when they stare down the beast, they're going to have that same, kind of feeling. We can't do this. We can't, except when they stare down the beast, those who remain will all as one pray and ask for Messiah to come and rescue them, and he will at that point. But it's desperate. The city's surrounded. No one can come in, no one can travel, no one can conduct business because you'd have to go through the military lines of the enemy. So nobody's traveling. They've eaten all the food that's outside there. There's no food to be had. It's all gone. They've stripped the land like a locust. Supplies and food can't come in, and what they have been able to take from other cities, they have with them. So no one can leave. This is an enemy, by the way, Assyria, who has broken all agreements previously made with no respect at all for those that were made. And when you think about the beast, he's going to make an agreement too, right? That he'll break. Now recall that King Hezekiah rebelled. He paid the tribute. But the Assyrian king took the money and then systematically began to siege and destroy all the surrounding cities of Judah. He killed whoever he could, and then took those who were left alive away into exile. Now, he shows that the world nation, par excellence, the military power of the day, Assyria, is also breaking covenants and contracts, and they're basically breaking all of it. The reference here is to Sennacherib's flagrant disregard for the deal he cut with Hezekiah when Hezekiah sent him all the money. So, and this has already been costly. It's cost all the cities around there. Isaiah points out the Assyrian has no problem killing people, has no problem breaking agreements. This is a picture of another Assyrian that Isaiah has pointed out in the future who will have no problem killing people and no problem breaking agreements. That's the Antichrist. He's going to break deals too. Daniel talks about it in Daniel 9:27. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. In other words, he's going to cut a deal with the nation of Israel. We'll protect you for 7 years. And for half of the week, he'll put an end to sacrifice and offering. So he'll make it for a week, but at the halfway point, 3.5 years, he'll show up at the reconstructed temple where they're already worshiping God and doing it in the temple and making sacrifices, all of that. And he'll show up at the Holy of Holies and says, worship me, I'm God. And then he'll enforce it. And Daniel says, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. In other words, he's pointing back to Isaiah saying, yeah, that's going to happen to this guy.
It's true that some of us are introverts and some of us are extroverts. But did you know Jesus designed us to function best when we're part of a community? We all have God-given gifts and abilities that, when used rightly and in conjunction with others, the effect for the kingdom of God will be profound. It will reach many who are lost and hurting. So, listeners, if you don't have a community that you belong to, won't you consider getting connected with ours? Or at least learning what we believe and why? The UnsafeBible.com has all that information, and we'd encourage you to read what's written there and then spend some time in prayer. The Unsafe Bible is a radio ministry based out of Jupiter, Florida. And we're so glad that you've paused long enough to listen to today's message from Pastor Ken. If you like what you heard today, and we've piqued your curiosity, why don't you satisfy it by checking out all the other messages we have for you? Go to the unsafebible.com and click on the Media tab. That's the direct link to our archive. We trust that what you find there will challenge and grow your faith. While you're there, be sure to check out the other ways to stay connected with what's happening here at Calvary Chapel, Martin County. Would you rather enjoy connecting through social media? You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Pick your favorite platform, or utilize all three. We trust that today's message from Isaiah spoke to your heart and challenged the parts of you that aren't looking like Jesus. Thanks for listening to the UnSafe Bible.